Steve, I wanted to come to you first. I don't know if I said we'd do that in the briefing, but now it just seems perfect. So here we are off piece. Steve, it's interesting. So Steve advised us in the building of the charter initially, and so is pretty much acquainted with what we've gone through to build it. But now you're working with ISBA, and so you're seeing the kind of other side of the coin. Obviously, you're aware of that in the role that you took within JICWebs. How does well, first of all, the issue itself, where is it at? How important is it? We know it's important, but what's the latest? Then the second half of the question, how does the charter look now that you see it from the other side?
Okay, well, I'll take the first point and split it into three about brand safety, viewability and fraud. So brand safety, clearly earlier in the year, the issues that were highlighted, which were more of a conduit, but were sort of surfaced by News UK in relation to YouTube, really helped to bring brand safety back into the limelight, public limelight. And really from a lot of brands' point of view, that was it was proper front page news. It hadn't been before. So whereas members of the team may have been aware of it, perhaps possibly within the marketing team or just digital part of the marketing team, it became board level conversation and became incredibly important, as you can imagine, in terms of reputational damage. So it was a very important sort of point in time because it highlighted an NEC which has been present for years. And I think most people in this room are aware of the challenge with a sort of increasingly longer supply chain and lack of transparency, that this does occur, and actually while you're buying, using that sort of supply chain, there is a risk attached to that. And while you can radically reduce that risk, you can't eradicate it totally. And as we saw with some of the facts and figures that preface the presentation, though, so even with premium publishers, that what constitutes brand safety or brand risk differs, I think, between what a publisher would consider risky and what an advertiser would consider risky. So very much the view is that a lot of brands, some brands are calling for zero risk. I don't think that's not necessarily achievable in the sense that, in the sense of having absolutely no risk at all. But I think a lot of measures can be taken, and brands are more in control of that and are pushing for that. And ISBA, a few months prior to my time at ISBA, then led certainly an initiative to try and change some of the controls that were in place on different platforms, including YouTube, that have materialised in terms of improved controls. So we're seeing some progress in that area, but it's still a journey. But I think it's creating much more awareness on the brand side around brand safety and what it means, and essentially the controls in place, and those controls that aren't in place and what changes need to occur. I think for fraud, it's been parked a little, I think, because brand safety has now kind of swung back into consciousness. Viewability was always the lead, and brand safety and fraud have kind of chopped and changed as being the most important. So fraud is a big concern, and clearly there are various reports in the market demonstrating how big it is, how much of a problem it is. That as good as we get in terms of detecting it, the more sophisticated methods of fraud. I think there's still a lack of awareness on the brand side about the different levels of fraud, how to tackle those. Again, how you can mitigate against it, but not reduce it to zero. But measures that can be taken realistically. I think a challenge that I saw at the IAB and still exists is the difference between how different parties, platforms then detect and monitor fraud and what they classify as fraud. There is a sort of almost a definite category, a kind of a safe category, and there's lots of grey in between. And while there's substantial differences between what people define as being fraudulent and non-fraudulent, I think we're going to continue to have some issues. And one of the things that JICWebs is trying to do is trying to at least standardise and tag in the States, trying to standardise that and try and standardise what fraud looks like, and as much as you can, but try to create some level of consistency. But we are, aware that there are challenges with that, and it is very much at the coalface and having to try and find fraud when it occurs, different forms, and you have to iterate against that, and it's all dependent upon R&D that platforms put into detecting and creating new ways of actually detecting fraud. So we realise it against a challenge. But I think it's still a concern, but it's sort of been not quite put on the back burner, but it's been parked a little bit. Viewability, I think, is leading, still the most important, the most important issue, I think, at the moment. Because if you look at bottom lines and the effect of it, that with figures that demonstrate from IAS and others that 50% of ads aren't seen, and then from that, what the remaining 50%, if they meet the 50 by 1 or 50 by 2, if you've designed a creative to obviously put forward messaging and trying to change someone's behaviour or trying to drive them through to sale. And you've created an ad with the intention of then saying, I want to play the ad in full to really get across my message. And there's only a fraction of the ad or a fraction of the duration. The challenge is then that you can, where there's a good ROI model and good attribution, it's more certain, but it becomes less certain in terms of econometric modelling and attribution models which are sort of guessed at, that viewability becomes really important, the opportunity to see the ad, but to try and see it as it was designed is becoming a massive challenge. So when you look at 50%, but then you raise it to 100% and then increase the duration, the percentage of ads diminishes significantly.
Yeah.
There is a case, of course, and case in point, meaning that brands have to make a creative that's appropriate for the platform and make sure they understand how the platforms work and making sure it's appropriate and it's reasonable. The creative delivery is delivered as expected, that it meets the acceptance guidelines. There's lots of must-haves as a result of being able to deliver an ad on time, in view. But it's a challenge for brands to kind of accept, I think, that if they created an ad to try and deliver a message, that if you're delivering just a fraction of it and arguing over the fractions of it and arguing for a lower standard, so I think the sort of having a good set standard which actually raises the bar, I think, is essential, and that journey is trying to deliver ads as they were designed.
Yeah. And do you agree that the standard that we're trying to create with the Charter is worthwhile, a higher standard, and something that the market needs?
Yes, I do. And I think the question would be then really on the viewability, because I guess that's the big question. There's a question about which standards are back and how far can people go. I think brands are very aware, and I'm certainly making it my role, getting into ISBAR to try and make sure there's more digital expertise, to realise the implications of that. Price will be a function of supply and demand. So we're not putting any, not suggesting what the price should be. I don't think anybody really should suggest what the price should be. That will be a function of what we determine to be a good standard, an agreeable standard in the market. But clearly there's some issues there with pricing in terms of how that will be affected, and I think that's sort of largely known about. And many, including Group M, have then been publicly declared, that they understand that and what the implications are. But they're finding more and more publishers are meeting higher criteria and higher standards, and with the analysis that Group M have done recently, raising to 100%, I think the supply went from, 18 to 54% of the supply that can meet the 100% in view. So we're seeing publishers then sort of galvanising around that and able to meet that supply, not all, but the market seems to be gradually moving towards and optimising so you can actually deliver on at least 100% in view. The duration is the trickiest part, I think, of that.
Okay, well, we're here to talk, aren't we? So, Bethan, Group M, you've been working on brand safety. What's what title does this come under at Group M?
It's a good question. So at Group M, we put all of these topics under brand safety now. It was digital risk. We now refer to them all under a brand umbrella term of brand safety. And we incorporate into that as well data protection. So it's a busy world of hot topics. But I think this was an opportunity for us to share the agency perspective as well on the ad quality draft charter as it's being built. And as I said, we have been working with you guys to look at it and give input and feedback. And I think there's three things I'd like to share that are kind of the agency perspective on this. And the first one is we are very supportive of premium advertising, content and context. And that is key message for everyone in the room. That is really important for us and for our clients, and they're realising more so now, maybe as they've learned from experiences throughout this year. And it helps us if we can work in those premium contexts and environments, because it fulfills a commitment we make to our clients. So we go out and talk to our clients and tell them, rightly or wrongly, is a challenge, that we will only invest where their ad has an opportunity to be seen, a fair opportunity to be seen, by a real person, so by a human, to a validated audience, and in an appropriate environment. So we're making big commitments and statements, and often we've touched on this and said, well, it's great to make those claims, and how do you measure and how do you actually enforce? We actually have that often in our contracts with our clients now. So clients are bringing in a normal contractual engagement, the standards they expect on viewability, on brand safety, on fraud. So there's a widening level of knowledge and a contractual responsibility now around these standards. So the first thing is it's really important for us to be in those premium spaces. They're key.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Because that first thing is something that's close to a lot of publishers' hearts. We've seen the trend that naturally came with programmatic and with data being shared, where the opportunity to target audiences became something that was the vogue, and not necessarily a bad thing, something that created productivity. I'm sure that wasn't done without, good reason. But as publishers, we know that there's value to context, and so it's I guess, interesting and rewarding to see that the discussion comes back now to the value of context, and we can start to inspect that more. And so it's just a comment actually, but does it mean that that's something that agencies see now on the buy side? It's kind of, okay, context has become important because of this issue, but also just because of the value that it creates.
Yeah, context has come back because the clients don't want to lose that opportunity to reach their audiences. That's key. But there's more and more understanding now that those audiences aren't on, and we touched on this when we were chatting earlier, on 500,000 sites or even 10,000 sites or even 2,000 sites. Those audiences are available on premium set number of sites, and you can reach them there, and you're reaching them in the environment that's likely to give you higher viewability, better brand safety in terms of the context of the page, that's less likely to have fraud. So you put all that together and the awareness is definitely rising. And that's not to say people are wanting to step away from following their wider audiences and making sure they're getting the message to them, especially in a performance-driven activity. But they still don't want to do that at the risk of being anywhere. So they want to know the transparency we've touched on, where they're actually running their advertising.
So are we right in thinking that if we build this charter as we are together, that we're taking the opportunity to, if you like, make it a bit more official and obvious, the kind of quality differential that we're offering to the market?
Absolutely, and I think we should. I think anyone who is a committed player now in the digital advertising space shouldn't be talking about the issues in our industry and we're growing up and we're maturing or we're teenager or this is just the challenge, because technology moves so fast. We have to stop that conversation and actually admit we're past teenage years, well past them, some of us now, in the industry I'm talking about. And so we need to talk about what does the digital industry do to compete with the other traditional medias and do it in a way that the other traditional media has progressed and grown and become a popular medium. So we need to do the same. So I think it's key.
So have I derailed you now from your other 2 points?
No, I can share them if you want
on.
quickly. I think you might like the other 2 points that I was going to share. The second one was I was going to share that we actually believe at Group M, and I might get some challenges on this, that you get what you pay for. So that's another message we're trying to put across to our clients, that actually you need to think about your CPMs in a different way. I'm just using CPMs because it's, again, most used for trading in digital in conversations with clients, but we're trying to make them understand the CPM's not the only criteria, and if you factor in your percentage of fraud, your percentage of absolutely no chance of an ad being seen, I'm not talking about viewability, different metrics here, but just no chance of the ad being seen, and you think about no viewability, no transparency or knowledge of where it's actually going to deliver, so it could be in a very unsafe environment, and factor that into your CPMs, your true CPMs are different. And what are you willing to pay for quality? And you should be willing to pay for quality because you want all of that, so look at the quality CPMs. And so we do start having that conversation about a quality CPM now, funnily enough. I don't know what it will become next, but that's what we're trying to get a message across then about how you should be willing to be willing to pay for what you want, and be aware of that. So that's and then the third point is just I was going to think about it last night, and it touches back really to, I think we're no longer teenagers, and I think we all need to chip in and do our bit to say we're all here to actually build, rather than a sort of downward spiral and a bit of a negative cycle. We all need to switch our heads into the virtuous circle and go, this is what we're going to do. So right from the beginning, as an ad creative, I'm going to build an ad to specs that isn't going to cause issues with latency, with endless tagging, with not rendering properly on the page, and I'm going to follow that. As an agency, I'm not going to buy anywhere that's not willing to confirm to me they have the controls in place around brand safety and especially fraud. Why would you turn your head to fraud? It's illegal. It's taking money out of your own pocket. As working with the client's very clear and understanding quality comes with a price and a fair price, and they need to be willing. And if we all play our part, that becomes a much better circle for us to all work in, rather than a circle going the other way. So I think we need to all put our hands up and dig in.
Okay, well, we certainly, that's part of the reason that we're here, isn't it? So, but there's welcome news in all of that as well, so thank you very much. Danny, I'd like you to give your perspective on what you're hearing so far.
I think it'd be easy to kind of present a really harmonious group, wouldn't it? But I think it's really important that we strike the right balance between I suppose it's that sense of positivity, and which kind of talks to that point around growing up and maturity. And I think it would be extremely dangerous of us to, I think, overlook some of the really significant issues that exist in the market. And I think it's a WPP AdLooks study that talks about a £16 billion fraud problem, and that still exists today. And so I think we need to find that balance. If you believe that digital advertising is an investment market, and investment markets are built upon investor confidence, of course, we want to portray this positive picture to our advertisers. But today, the reality is there's a huge disconnect. The Guardian, we're fortunate enough to have a scaled proposition. We've got 160 million unique browsers per month. We have an engaged audience. We could talk about dwell time, but we have more people paying for our content, despite not having a paywall than we've ever had. And we have trust as well. We're one of the most trusted, in fact, sorry, the most trusted online news brand ahead of the BBC. And that matters to advertisers when we leverage that through our fewer better strategy, which means low clutter, and ensuring that our ads deliver cut through. And if you believe that an ad being seen by a human eye, so seen beyond viewable, being viewed and engaged with by a human eye in a brand safe environment, the Guardian and its peers deliver around 3 times as much value as a long tail site. And I think the issue then, if you think about the size of the scale issue and then what premium publishers offer, our non-human traffic score is around 0.2%. You might know this off the top of your head, Paul. So we see crawlers, as is natural. However, that aggregated amount of crawlers does not add up to £16 billion. So the question is, where is that coming from? And I would assert that actually, where our inventory is quality, where we have engagement, where we can deliver the ROI, and our inventory is available via programmatic today, and I'd refer to that as we are the primary market publishers. The issue is the secondary market, which is horizontally integrated, is churning inventory through its ranks, and is the point in the ecosystem where the loss of control allows fraud to be injected, and value to be extracted between buyer and seller without their knowledge. So I don't think we should brush away from that, brush over that. I think it's really important that buyers, if this is about investment and this is about understanding ROI, buyers need to approach it as such and start making some quite interesting decisions around how they invest. And I would put a massive red flag against the secondary market. And it looks more like a jumble sale than a premium publisher sale.
So is that specifically the secondary market? What are we talking about?
So I think it'd be easy. So the challenge that exists is the fact that inventory is being churned through that secondary market. So my understanding is most of the exchanges are horizontally integrated with one another. And it means that it's very difficult, even as a publisher, to get a really good understanding of where our inventory is being distributed, which is why we're massively interested in ads or text. So video is a great example. We only make our video available via a single vendor. However, it appears in 110 different sales points through 220 different seats. And that's how our customers can buy up to 30 million TheGuardian.com video views every day, whilst we only have 500,000 available. So it's it's a really significant issue.
Yeah. What's the solution? Buy through the primary point.
So I would absolutely advocate that. So I think there's one of the promise of technology has been around improved automation, improved efficiency through automation. However, the loss of control from both buyers and sellers in handing over to algorithms to make their decision, creates that weakness, that vulnerability in the system that has ultimately meant that ads an ad space that would never have been bought by brands has been bought. So this is how you end up with BMW and Breitbart, Mercedes advertising around terrorism content or related content on YouTube. And so I'm not saying don't do retargeting and don't buy from exchanges ever, but I think also recognise how you're investing and the inherent risks and benefits associated with each. And one of the challenges that exists in the market is the fascination around price. I think there's this quite interesting dynamic between the publisher's yield, the buyer's margin, and the advertiser's outcome. And that creates a friction that means that ad spend ultimately gets pushed towards low quality inventory that delivers high performance and which creates a market for fraud. So I think it's important that, again, premium publishers are recognised for their quality and the assurance that they offer advertisers. And I think the market's, I think there's some references to investing in quality and price being a consideration. And I think the wider market has got a lot of work to do around that.
Do you think that building the charter this way, interacting with ISBA, interacting with GroupM and the buy side, and raising these issues, and it's great. It would be great if we just all stood here and the AOP was having a big love fest and we were clapping along to the charter, but actually it isn't really about that. This is about delivering something that works better for everybody. So if we're going to build to me it seems obvious, right, that we build the charter, we stay in interaction, we deal with the issues, but that charter is there to make it kind of, if you like, almost enshrined in stone that we have that quality standard. So I see the question here that says, are rates going up yet? And I know we've already had the discussion with Bethan in the past where they're, in principle, yes, we will put rates up, but we also have to make this thing clearer and easier to understand as a high quality product and take it to the market that way. Do you think that makes sense?
The reality is that quality is scarce.
Yeah.
And I think as the market wakes up to that realisation, then it creates, without publishers changing their prices, where the market is setting that price, you'd expect to see yield inflation. And just to be really clear, change is required. Investors are demanding change, and I would say the investors are advertisers and their buyers and publishers. And so we've got to find, there's got to be change, and significant change, in order for us to address the issues that that persist. And we have to find ways of, I suppose, demonstrating our individual commitment to upholding those values and driving evolution, and also creating pressure around others in our community. And that feels like a really, really important point, I think. The conversations I'm still having, I used the video example earlier, when I try and get data that explains how on earth there's 30 million Guardian video ad calls available to buyers every day. I want to know who's responsible for that. But what I'm being told by the big vendors is that they have contracts in place that preclude them from calling out names. So, shining a light, creating reward for good behaviour and recognition, and jeopardy attached to negative behaviour is really, really key, and it does require everyone to create that pressure.
Yeah, I see a question here about data privacy. I'm not sure if I'm getting this right, but presumably the need for data privacy is going to start to make it sort of legally dangerous for people to start using inventory in a way that isn't agreed and transparent. I don't know, Steve will probably know about that, but it certainly sounds that way from the GDPR work that we've been doing. But that point of buy through the primary point, is that something that makes sense to you, Bethan, or is it something that can work? We can come to agreement on that and...
No, it completely makes sense, and a lot of our GroupM deals are directly with our partners, and even if it's into a programmatic space, it's again a direct integration and commitment. So we know we have full domain transparency as part of our requirement, and the publishers know as well that they're feeding into that specific space, and they know we're a legitimate buyer. We're not some sort of mysterious buyer and going to into an exchange that's going who knows where. So I think it's really important that there are those direct relationships, and I think they are there for a lot of the premium players in the room today. I think that what you're addressing is there's still challenges elsewhere, and how do we educate everyone around other types of buying aren't as safe, and do you really want to buy that way? Just because you're getting a lower price, you're not going to get the results you want in terms of the returns on investment and the actual results you're trying to drive with your marketing. Even if you think it's a lower CPM, you're actually not showing it to humans. You're not actually having a fair opportunity for your ad to be seen. And that's what we need to educate around, and have people then actually make the commitment and decision to step away from some of that lack of transparency, unless they have the guarantees put in place to help them understand what they're doing and buying that. And we see that coming, right, with some of the ad exchanges are trying now to say they'll bring more transparency through. They'll use ad.text, themselves, and they'll indicate which of their supply is actually going to be referenced in Ad.set, so you can opt out if someone's not willing to participate in the program. So we're seeing it impacting the wider environment, but it's not as quick as we probably
it needs to be called out. I mean, that's part of this process. Actually, a question for you, Steve. Let's say we start to make this. Actually, a charter is something that both sides of the agreement really commit to, okay? And so it's kind of, on the buy side, Group M are committing to delivering quality in this way.
Dylan, before you complete your question, I want to change the language. Let's say, to suggest that it's a consideration. I think it's a commitment. And I think that I will obviously allow you to ask Steve his question, but, listening to Danny, for me, having been occupying media owner space for most of my career, your frustrations, the points that you make, what I feel deep inside myself, and it has wound me up. And it's wound me up to a level that when I first took on the role at AOP, I really wasn't sure how one could address it. It's interesting how circumstances collide, situations occur that create a sea change, and these last 6 to 12 months, certainly obviously since the P&G Pritchard moment, what it is for me is also a very important opportunity to do exactly what you're suggesting, is let's make very clear the differentiation between what is available to you to invest in as an advertiser. And when in the past we've highlighted any of those issues relating to that, the frustration has always been that really no one was listening. And whatever the circumstances that have created this current situation we are now in, it's not about being opportunist, it's about capitalising on the fact that everybody's attention is on this point now. So the mature and the responsible thing for us as an industry to all do is to try and create tangible points from which we can build foundations for discussion to move forward. But the reality is, we without adoption of initiatives like this and other initiatives that are out there, we are never going to take full advantage of that opportunity to clearly differentiate. Unfortunately, we're a small team in the AOP, and I think the average age, it's slightly undermined by the fact that Dilip and I are there. But us aside, when I use expressions like separating wheat from chaff, everyone looks at me and like, planet's this bloke on. But quite frankly, that's the best way I can explain this. This is an opportunity to create very clear transparencies around that supply chain. And I want to emphasise this in that context of, you don't always get the attention you want. People are not always listening. Anyone here is a parent knows exactly what I mean by that. But the reality is, right now, while we have that attention, we have to be responsible, mature, grown up, and all pull together while there is the focus on this to make it right. And we can't ever sit there complacently, just using nice big words, saying one day we will, or this will. And obviously, I'm not aiming this directly at you, but I'm not going to use language that say we do this. Perhaps in a situation if we did. No, we must do this for the health of our industry. Sorry.
Okay, Good, thank you. I'll assimilate the language. The question actually was, Steve, that actually what Group M are doing is saying there are good buying practices, and we are saying we're going to respond with good selling practices. And that part of that process, Danny is suggesting, we need to call out the people that are buying badly as well as the people that are selling badly.
I was talking about the middle of the market in that example, but I think the reality is, and there's issues at the publisher end as well. So I think that obligation has to run through there.
Yeah.
Through it, rather than, and I want to be really clear, especially with Beth on the panel, that I'm not just saying the issue's over there.
Sure.
Go and tidy it up.
Yeah. And so I think where it comes to is that, in the end, clients are where this initiative's been driven from, and understandably. And do you think that then the next response is that you'll be able to say, okay, look, for those of you that are really committed to brand safety, here are the places that you can do this the safe kind of way. But do you think there are some clients that at the moment are kind of, we don't really care, we don't mind where the buying goes through, it's just about, okay, how do we get to those people, how do we help them to understand the value of doing things the right way?
I think it varies depending on the type of brand and depending on their objectives. So if it's purely direct response, clearly brand safety and brand care are incredibly important and fairly universal. Any brand certainly would definitely want to be associated with any form of legal content. So to say brand safety isn't important to a direct response client, I think would be disingenuous. It is. But in terms of viewability and fraud, you can run the numbers and say, well, look, can I still achieve my objectives, knowing that I can buy at a lower price and knowing there's a margin of fraud and lack of viewability there. But actually I can put in place some measures knowing about, optimising towards better viewability, optimising towards the outcome, and maybe I can, that it's okay to have a level of fraud and viewability. It's not ideal, but I can optimise towards it. If you're a brand advertiser or you're foot in both camps and again, it's a brand campaign, so actually then have very low viewability and very high fraud, it becomes, obviously it's a much greater challenge. So it's very important brand advertisers to actually understand, has the ad had the opportunity to be seen? Because the understanding how it's shifting and what brand metrics and how it's shifting brand metrics is much longer. It's a much longer term goal, and actually understanding how it's shifting is much more difficult to measure. So the opportunity of actually having the ad to be seen in the first place with a human eye is really, really important, that premise, rather than just running the numbers, because the measure at the end of it isn't definitive. So it becomes very, very important. So I think it's important to all brands in these areas and aspects. But I think the biggest, I think a lot of it is about understanding where the responsibility lies. It's collective responsibility. I think there are too many people for me in the industry, and it's very easy where people point fingers and they either defend heavily or they attack. There's not a lot of doers actually going, let's go and fix it. And I think what this helps to do, and clearly there's a lot of trade associations and a lot of big groups, some publishers, some agencies within that, is actually going and trying to fix it. Take responsibility and accept responsibility where you can. Do point out where the shortfall is and shortcomings in others are, but take responsibility for what you can control, rather than just saying, that's not work, that doesn't work, therefore I'm not going to do it. Actually take responsibility for what you can do. And I think this charter then definitely helps with achieving that. It is also incumbent upon the brand, the agency also at a contract negotiation level to have fair pricing, because a lot of this trickles down from having probably not a realistic contract in place and a fee structure which rewards the agency, which is tied to the objectives of the client, which allows them to reward and pay their suppliers fairly to deliver on those objectives. We've got to a sort of, again, and I remember it's sort of particularly becoming an audience-first strategy. Get the audience wherever they can. It's all about audience, and price just spiralling, and price was already diminishing anyway, and it sort of went off a cliff. It's who can supply the cheapest possible CPM to deliver on that, and hence people then exploited that. So you know what, I can deliver as an unknown quantity in the supply chain. I can undercut that premium publisher by 90%, and I can deliver that to you in its premium impression. Nobody could really check. The tools are now in place. People are now getting wise to it. So a lot of these issues are coming from the fact of actually having a realistic kind of fee structure in place, which rewards everyone, but it does require everybody to say, I'm responsible for this. I'm not just responsible for the left and right. I take collective responsibility, and I'm going to hold the people who I do business with responsible, rather than just saying it's their fault. and that requires all parties on all sides of the chain. So procurement have got to be delivered, on the client side, have got to negotiate a fair contract. Agencies are doing their part in making sure that they are working with ethical suppliers and making sure they're delivering on client objectives, and publishers also then making sure that they're taking responsibility for delivering against those objectives and being paid fairly for it, but delivering on those objectives and making sure that they are bought into that.
Yeah.
So there's a responsibility across the supply chain, but we've got to take that responsibility. And key to that is trying to fix the issues, point them out, but come and fix them. Don't just point them out and say, I'm not playing because there's an issue with that person over there. Come and fix it, call that out, but also take responsibility for what you can control.
There's a fascinating point, a point that fascinates me within that, which is around the performance benchmarks of yesterday. If we've been carrying these issues to this point, where we're kind of 10 years in, and you have a CPA chart that's being presented by a trader to their CMO, and they'll have a nice, either flat or gradual decline. And there's a point where there's the question of whether there's a requirement for the reset moment or the amnesty, where I suppose people say those statistics that we've been reporting to this point are actually grounded on false benchmarks, because there's going to be some quite, if you think about what that means for people's day-to-days, logically there's going to have to be some quite difficult conversations, but that needs to be allowed to happen as well. Otherwise, we end up just caught in this cycle.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? There are so many of these issues that we're here to try and identify, to make sure that we get to the point of solving them rather than just having a charter and saying, oh, that's solved and done. We want to get to that point and to understand, I guess, that the next steps from this are that we start to be we're getting specific already, right? But we get much more specific. Okay, here's the piece, let's say it's the primary purchase point. What are we going to do about that? Oh, it works this way. And we go through each of those steps, don't we? So if part of the challenge is identifying some of those disconnects and problems, Paul, you're kind of ecosystem player. We've got people at different sides here. You're a bit of a connector.
Yeah.
What are you seeing as the challenges you need to think about?
The key challenges, I guess, from the publisher side, the main challenges I hear on a day-to-day basis are a couple of things. I mean, first of all, around the creative latency issue. That really is a conversation I have in probably around 50% of my meetings with publishers. So again, there needs to be a joined up approach, both from the sales side and probably across the agency groups as well, just in terms of, if you are going to give me a really heavy creative that's going to take 2 to 3 seconds to load and a 70% viewability target, they don't really go sort of hand in hand. That really is a big challenge for publishers. On the brand safety side,
so let's deal with in the spirit of dealing with things. Right? Let's look at that. It's something that I hear a lot from publishers too. It's a natural thing. There are other elements of this, the multiple calls from programmatic and all the rest that cause latency, but that piece is one that's a massive pain point. And it is something we've kind of briefly discussed with Beth before. I'm not trying to point any fingers, because it's a bit more complicated than just saying agencies send us the wrong kind of creative. Obviously, creative agencies have got different objectives and these things happen quickly, but we'd like to get to a point that says, okay, here are the requirements of delivering a better ad, because it impacts in other things, into ad blocking and all the rest of the user experience. So do you think it's a reasonable thing to say that we want to start to try to push more compliance towards that kind of lighter loading ad?
Absolutely. We are, as you know, Group M, and I know the Coalition for Better Ads has its own challenges that have been discussed separately, but we completely buy into the fact that that's based off consumer feedback as well around what ads annoy consumers, so they don't want to see them. And then tied to that, the lean guidelines from IB around what does that mean in terms of then ads that are acceptable to consumers, how do you make sure they're as lightweight as possible and yet still can be, have the impact in terms of the actual messaging that can be put into the ad and the format and delivered on the different channels and different properties where they're going to be seen. And we also think have started to distinguish as well on our side around that there should be different acceptability of ads in these different channels. So even in viewability, we've taken a look recently, 100% view still there, it's still our big part, but we started looking at within scrolling news feeds, within social, within out of stream, by again, consumer behaviour led and needing to think about what the ad design should be to get the message across in the way it is being consumed. What do we need to do? And I think that all leads into better ad specs. And the same way we put in our contracts, that if the ad isn't to the specs, then absolutely it can be rejected. I think we need to just commit to upholding that. So every time an ad comes through to a publisher and it isn't to spec, it's too heavy, etc., absolutely within their right to say no, not running, should do, and we should be flagging that back up to creative and client and saying here's the problem. And so after a point there'll probably be a change in behaviour that they'll make sure they are to spec, because if it keeps going back saying no, delayed another 2 days, then obviously the frustration will build to the point where we'll hopefully start having ads come through.
The challenge is a publisher might push back and say we're not going to accept these ads, but there might be another publisher out there who then accepts the ad. So I guess it is around collaboration.
It's easier to manage in a direct sales process, but obviously the problem is, the root problem is through the programmatic space, where there doesn't seem to be a channel or a route
rejection
back onto that. Exactly. And I mean, obviously, as you stated, you guys work predominantly around those direct relationships. You see the value of that context and that direct relationship, but and do less programmatically. But it's still why there needs to be, there are lead guidelines, there have been compliance issues, there have been talk before, Mark Pritchard, about the fact that we don't spend money with organisations that don't comply by independent audience verification and everything. Well, we know that's not true, because there's two massive benefactors out there that neither currently provide that level of transparency that the media owners do. The people at the bottom of that list there on the questions, but the reality is that how do we then, in the spirit of maturity, work together to not just fix the bit that we know already works pretty well anyway, because you have explicit contracts with media owners on that direct side. How do we broaden this to make sure that it's not anywhere in the supply chain?
Wish I knew the answer to that one, but I think some of the steps we could take just as a group, and this is probably something we'd have to agree, the kind of people on the panel agree to, is we should run this and find out who's flowing, where these ads are flowing from to, and which publishers are accepting them, and then from that study just report it so it's out in the public domain for everyone to make a decision on. We're seeing where these ad formats that aren't to spec are flowing through the advertising
a lot
chain.
of the results can come from calling out bad practice, and then if some kind of compliance tool is out there or whatever, which we might have heard of, is the sort of thing that we can start to look into. Does that sound reasonable, Dan?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, it does sound reasonable. So I'm just kind of thinking about the steps in the process. Thinking about it from a practical level. Again, maybe that's just a fantastic example of, I suppose, shared responsibility. There is part of me that kind of wishes we could avoid being the person that has to measure it and send it back, when ultimately there's someone who's creating it in the first place, who could be managing themselves perhaps. But as an example, I think that's a good one as to the source of certain behaviours and where they sit, and actually the implications which aren't necessarily exposed to the originator of the problem.
Paul, I interrupted your flow there. Sorry, but
You did, and I've completely
roll,
forgotten
wasn't
it.
you were just coming on to brand safety, so it was beautifully explained.
The other challenge, okay. I guess my first sort of personal point, I feel like maybe publishers have been sort of unfairly hit over the head, so to speak, with the whole sort of brand safety challenge, and I don't necessarily think that was Murdoch's intention when he wrote that article. But I guess the big challenge I see, from
Google and
the
Facebook
publisher
to
side,
their, they were in the headlines.
Indeed, yeah.
yeah.
But I didn't necessarily think Murdoch thought that the brand safety challenge would lead to some challenges with other publishers as well. I guess it's brought it up to sort of top of the agenda on the buy side, and it's definitely the number one sort of conversation we have with brands. They're very much around brand safety as their top priority out of the three sort of major media quality points. But I guess from putting my publisher hat on, the main challenge they have is understanding the objectives of those brands that are running on those sites. What keyword lists are they applying? What brand safety settings are they applying? So I think to make it as effective as possible, there needs to be, brands and advertisers need to be as upfront as possible at the start of campaigns, effectively, rather than mid-campaign, end of campaign, talking about, how you didn't hit my brand safety guidelines, thresholds, etc. So I just think being upfront and transparent from the outset is really important.
No, I was going to say that there's a bit of work to be done around brand safety and brand care. I think often people rally against it. Well, actually, brand safety, if you're lumping me in with illegal, that might be terrorist content, might be others, I don't want my brand to be shown against that, but it's perfectly good content. There's a difference, but rawly and purely from a brand point of view, they still don't want their ad to be shown against it. So I think there's a bit of work that needs to be done by the industry to buy into this idea of brand care. So it still means that the brand needs to be very clear, and the agency on behalf of the brand about what is acceptable and what isn't. I think we need to get less hung up on the fact of saying it's not brand safe and react to that from a publisher point of view and saying, but my content's legitimate. It's not saying it isn't. It's just saying that actually from a brand point of view, they might not want to be associated which is with what could be fantastic quality content, but they're just very, very reticent to be associated, no matter how safe it appears. I think there's a disparity between sometimes between buyers and publishers in terms of what does constitute safe and what doesn't constitute being safe. So I think there possibly is, maybe a reframing of calling it brand care with brand safety and saying that we're not saying it's bad content, it's just content that still don't.
Yeah.
And I think the acceptance of that as well. So I think there's a bit of work to be done.
Yeah, and of course, in those situations, a publisher doesn't want to be flagged as unsafe, but there will be times when it's not the right environment, and that everyone gets that. Look, I'm getting the red light, but there's a question here that we should really talk about, which says, how does this set of standards set up publishers to provide more value to clients than and win against Google and Facebook?
Well, we're being independently measured by the likes of this fine gentleman, which is significantly different from Google and Facebook, who mark their own homework and have a pretty questionable record of doing so in some areas.
Not anymore, though, Danny. So they do
your
what they do
integration is going to solve that.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Well, I beg to disagree. I'm sorry. They still mark their own homework, as far as you know. And we've had plenty of these conversations, as you know. They provide some data that is then validated, and not they're saying is they're going to take their data to the MRC and ask the MRC to independently validate that they are doing their measurement to the standards, which is a step in the right direction, but it's still not third party. And so they could still make an error, as they have done with their video measurements, accidentally, just a technical engineering error that someone overlooked, as we saw reported, and we still have no way of really knowing if we're getting the true data.
Yeah.
So for us, it doesn't give us confidence yet in those parties that we're getting a true third-party verification. That's no criticism of the third-party verification partners. It's of the big players not letting others in to do the same validation. And that's a key thing for us, and we push them every day on that question, as I'm sure others do.
Yeah, I think publishers just focus on what you do best, and what we've talked about on this panel. The quality content, the high levels of viewability, the controlled environment, the low levels of ad fraud. I know, Richard, you mentioned clutter as being part of the AOP charter, and I think that's been lost almost. In terms of sort of conversation alongside context. So focus on what you do well. Obviously you haven't got the scale and potentially the first-party data, some of the big sort of social platforms, but by focusing on what you do well, then you will compete against them.
I think we do have a fair amount of scale. And I think that's kind of the context has shifted with the likes of the monster platforms. And I think we do need to be recognised. Maybe it's to your point, we do need to be recognised for the quality and also the trust, and the assurance that we give our buyers, and the fact that if there is an issue, heaven forbid, with a buy, Beth can give me a call and we can have a chat about it.
Yeah.
Which is there's a feedback loop there, and I dare say we'd be punished for our mistakes as well.
Thank you.
I also think on that last point, I'm sorry, but it has to be said that the building again on the momentum that is there, the calls by ISBA and IPA to support independently verified, kite marked media. If nothing else, all that any of us want apart from quality and standards, is to be able to compete in a level playing field. And I know we've all said this before, but if this momentum towards standards and initiatives like our Quality Charter at least allow us to openly and transparently examine what a fair playing field looks like, then it's a positive thing, and it matters.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you very much for joining us, and also with all the work that we've done up to now to put this together. And thank you all for being here, joining in. We want you to remain with us because we've got a short, snappy session now that should be interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.